Today's podcast is presented by Podgo. Podgo is the easiest way for you to monetize your podcast, providing podcasters with a flat rate for ad space so you always know how much you get when you include an ad from Podgo. I recently joined as a member, and you can too. Apply today to become a member and immediately be connected with advertisers that fit your audience. That's podgo.co at podgo.co. When you become a member, enter Suburban Folk in the podcast that you heard about them. If you need help with editing, music production, or anything else related to your podcast, reach out to me at greg@suburbanfolk.com to discuss how I can help you get your voice heard. Health, travel, finance, parenting, and home improvement. This is the Suburban Folk Podcast.
$250 a month into my child's $529 from the month that they start kindergarten. I should be able to pay for 80% of my child's college.
Because I don't trust that most people will eat their vegetables. So usually our kind of standard is 3 servings of vegetables per meal.
You take something like a 2x6 and you cut it with a circular saw. That's like a superpower.
Those middle school years are not as fun, but at that age, they're still willing to talk to you.
Welcome to the Suburban Folk Podcast. I'm your host, Greg. Today's topic is travel. We're still holding out hope that despite all of the lockdowns due to COVID-19, someday we'll get back to a sense of normalcy and be able to experience all the benefits of travel. In the meantime, in today's episode, when reminiscing about past experiences and what these benefits are, we draw an interesting parallel between seeing cultures, realizing how other people live, and connecting that to the other big issue of the day, which is diversity and inclusion, in particular, the Black Lives Matter movement. There is an interesting and encouraging overlap between what you can learn while you're traveling, seeing people as individuals, as well as making sure that you have diversity and inclusion in the top of your mind during your daily life. My guest is Tonya Fitzpatrick. She's the co-founder of World Footprints, a socially conscious travel media platform that includes the award-winning World Footprints podcast. Her podcast features distinguished guests like the late Dr. Maya Angelou, and it shares stories about the transformative power of travel and our common humanity. She's a 3-time TEDx and international speaker, lawyer, author, and Explorers Club member. She was appointed as a delegate to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women and is a former White House political appointee. She graduated from the London School of Economics, Wayne State University Law School, and she attended East China University of Politics and Law. She has been featured in MSNBC, U.S. News and World Report's, Black Enterprise, and in several books. Tonya, thanks for joining the show today.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Can you go ahead and kick us off by telling us about your background, what led you into the world of travel and founding your company, World Footprints?
My background's very eclectic. I'm a lawyer. I'm a former White House appointee. I have served as a delegate for the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. I have worked in the nonprofit arts world, which I love, and travel journalist. And as odd as it sounds, all of those things, you know, they're kind of like spokes on a wheel that have really formed the hub of what I do now with World Footprints. And golly, the genesis of World Footprints, it started when I was 5 years old. I knew at that time because I had an uncle who was living in England, and he would return home to my home state of Michigan, where I grew up as a kid. And I was so fascinated by his life, by his accent. My aunt was a Brit. And so I promised myself at that age, at 5 years old, I was going to live in London. And I was just fascinated at that time that there was a world beyond my block, as a 5-year-old kid. So fast forward several years later, I ended up moving to London, and I went to university there. I did grad studies at the London School of Economics, and I tried my darndest to stay in London. And but my visa, I wore out my welcome through my visa. And so I returned back home to Michigan and went to law school, and then came to Washington, D.C. I'm just up the street from you. With the intent on joining the Foreign Service because I really wanted to get back overseas. I ended up enjoying a really stellar legal career, and oddly enough, my husband and I were on travel, and he's also a lawyer, and he's my partner in World Footprints. We were on travel. We met a woman and her sister at a bar, and of course, you talk to everybody at cocktail hours, and I was complaining about my job and just the legal profession. At that particular time, I was a senior legal advisor at Homeland Security. So again, wonderful job, great salary, wonderful people I worked with, but I wasn't happy. And I just had this nagging feeling that there was something else I needed to do that I should be doing. And she talked to my husband, kind of gave him a couple of questions to prompt me with when we later on that evening. And he did. He asked a couple of questions. And essentially what it boiled down to is that travel was and has always been my passion. And so within a month, we opened a travel agency because, again, I was so determined to leave the legal profession and do something that I loved. And we opened a travel agency. We started doing a lot of television in Washington, D.C. on CBS and NBC. We did a couple of national cable cast, and that caught the attention of a talk radio station here in D.C. And they invited us to do a radio show, a travel show. And from there, we went, from terrestrial to digital way back in the day when podcasts were just kind of coming out. This is, I think, 2008, 2009. And the rest, as they say, is history. We closed the travel agency, and I determined that I really like the media side of travel more than I like selling tickets. So we closed the agency, and we rebranded and formed World Footprints.
I have to ask you not to focus in on the lawyer profession, but I just finished Michelle Obama's book, and there's a large theme in what she describes as wanting to get into things other than being a lawyer. Is that common among the industry?
You would be surprised. There is this, I won't even say underground society of recovering attorneys. There are a number of people who leave the legal profession. And, for whatever reason, we go into it, whatever motivates people. For me, it was an interest and a strong belief in social justice. Other people go into it for the money. You find them leaving. Like, there's one fellow we've met here, and he used to be a lawyer, I think, with one of the government agencies, and he left his lawyering job to make cupcakes, and he formed the company Cake Love, it's called. I don't know if you've heard of it, but he ended up with a show on the Food Network. So, yeah, you think I'm extreme. He went from lawyering to making cupcakes. And
do you subscribe to one track versus another? Meaning some people will say, follow your passions and the money will follow, as opposed to, let's stick with the lawyer example, maybe doing what seems to be right at that time, whether it's chasing the dollar or just thinking you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Do you subscribe to one way or the other, sort of going through that lawyer track and then really following your passion afterward?
For me, I think following my passion has led to other things. It certainly hasn't resulted in the money I made as a lawyer. I don't discount that time because I think it was valuable. And I subscribe to the belief that you are where you're supposed to be at that moment. And at the moments in my life, I was supposed to be a lawyer at the White House or Homeland Security, or those were the things that I was supposed to be doing because they led to something else for me. And oddly enough, I still use lawyering in my work as a travel journalist today. I still tap into social justice when we raise awareness about things like human trafficking. That's very important to us. And I understand why human trafficking is a very difficult crime to nip in the bud, and why it's difficult to punish those who traffic other individuals. And even with reviewing contracts for World Footprints, I can do that. And as my husband, who's also a lawyer, we have that ability. And so lawyering, and I will always be a lawyer. I just don't want to practice the rest of my life, because I think it's more meaningful and purposeful for me to do what I'm doing through World Footprints right now. And, there's a philosophy that we operate on, and it's one that World Footprints was based on. It was based on the philosophy of a Zulu word called Ubuntu. Ubuntu, and it basically means I am because we are, and it speaks to our common humanity. It speaks to our responsibility to be of service to others, and that's exactly what we do through World Footprints.
Let's continue with that theme and what travel can and should do for you. What you're saying resonates with me in that it brings people together. Hopefully it fosters understanding as you experience other cultures and the way people do things. What do you view as the core benefits of travel?
Transformation, bottom line, and that's something I've spoken on the TEDx stages about and other stages. There is a very powerful transformation that occurs because of travel. And it's not just personal transformation, which is very strong. You learn a heck of a lot about yourself when you're traveling and, faced with different circumstances and other challenges. Professional, it could lead to professional transformation. Some people may go to a country and find, I love it here too much to leave. And, and they'll end up working in a different field because they've, discovered a new love. But I also think that travel, strongly believe that travel leads to psychological transformation in that a lot of times when we travel, we may travel with certain preconceptions about a culture or destination. And when we go to that place, and I can give you some stories, and I've spoken about these folks on the stage, but when you go to a place, it really opens your mind and your eyes to who those people are that you had preconceptions about before. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And likewise, when we travel as Americans, we're putting a different face on who we are. And I think we're allowing people to separate politics from American citizens. And so we get a chance to be ambassadors for our own country. And again, that's equally as powerful. And I think it leads to connectivity. And really, I think it fosters peace in some ways, because when you're traveling someplace and maybe you're dining with people that you may have met or maybe even the people who serve you, but when you break bread with someone, you're not likely to go to war with that person.
An example that I have that probably fits what you're talking about, I did a trip to Northern Ireland years ago, and it was specifically to further our understanding of the Troubles and how people were living amongst their communities. Was there still Catholic versus Protestant streets? Turns out there were, and we actually got to talk to people from a couple different schools from each side to see what their perspective was and what the history was. Here's a good example. When talking about what sports do you like, we mentioned baseball. That's an American sport. And the guy kind of, crinkled his face and wasn't really into it. Well, the reason is because he was on the Catholic side, I guess you'd say, and he relates baseball to cricket, which he thinks of as a British sport. So that is something that we learn. Well, flash forward to years and years later, a friend of mine who is from Northern Ireland was describing where he grew up, and he said specifically Londonderry. And I had at least picked up enough knowledge during my trip to know that if you are on the Protestant side, you're going to say Londonderry as opposed to the Catholic side saying Derry. So dare I say, I think he was a little impressed that I had some knowledge of that background and that history and could at least follow what he was talking about or have some kind of frame of reference, which I think is a very powerful thing.
And I think, again, the fact that you had that knowledge and were sharing, that knowledge with your friend. I mean, imagine what he, thought about you afterwards. I'm sure he was blown away, because that's something that's not commonly known. And so you put the face of a very intelligent American on, in that conversation.
Hey, let's be honest. As Americans, we're always combating that egocentric, don't know anything except for what we see around us day to day. So anything I can do to buck that stereotype, I'm trying to help out with.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is great. We're fed with, there's so much noise around us, whether it be social media or family or friends or mainstream media. There's so much noise, and that noise kind of shapes our beliefs. And the one thing that I love about travel is that it helps you confront your own unconscious bias, and we all have them. I have them, and I can happily share a story when I was confronted. But the one story I did want to share with you, because it's so powerful, it's such a powerful example of what we were just talking about, is we interviewed a woman who is from a little bit south from you. I think North Carolina. She's a jazz singer, an African-American woman, jazz singer, returned to music at later age. She's in her 40s or so. And this was about maybe 20 years ago. But she has made an incredible name for herself. At her the early start of her career, her manager booked her on a tour schedule in Germany. And she did not want to go to Germany, and she fought her manager, and she ended up, relinquishing and going. And but she didn't want to go because she felt, first of all Germans were racist. They didn't like Black people, and they wouldn't like her music, and she thought she'd be wasting her time. But she went, and she decided to really lean into her craft. And she told me in this interview, she said, "Tonya, I was so ashamed of myself, because not only did they embrace me and my music, people were very gracious, and to this day, she calls Germany her second home. In fact, I believe she owns a second home in Germany. But she grew up at a time when what she heard about Germans came from her parents, who were of the World War II era, certainly during some of the earlier troubles, race riots and what have you. And there's still issues. There are still issues in Germany, as there is, many other countries. But she grew up with a perception that all Germans are racist people, and she said she was so ashamed that as an African American woman who had been painted with a broad stroke and had been subject to racism, that she was also doing the same to one culture. And but her travels to Germany changed that.
That's a great example of what travel can do for anybody, and I would totally agree that I've had those kinds of experiences. Is there certain kinds of travel that you feel foster those kinds of interactions more so than others? For example, I pick on my wife all the time because it turns out she is a Disney fiend. So I always pick on the prepackaged Disney vacations as, hey, this isn't really getting you out there and seeing much culture and so on. Maybe while the kids are young, it's fine. But, once you get a little bit older, let's really see some more historical things or something that's not so prepackaged. What do you recommend as ways to ensure you're getting a good taste of the area that you are traveling to?
I say set intentions. Set your intentions. What do you want out of your trip, even beyond the R&R? I mean, we all want R&R, but what is it you want? And I also think it's important to be open to any changes in your plans, to not set such a strict itinerary that if it changes, it'll throw you off, because it's, some of the most pleasures come in the surprises when that happens. But I think even with a Disneyland and an all-inclusive resort, I mean, look, we're travel journalists, but there are times I want a day of pampering and to have, drinks sent to me. But even on those days, I take a moment to get to know the people who are serving me. That's a good way to really understand the local cultures, to talk to locals. When Ian and I travel anywhere, if we're taking a car, an Uber or a taxi cab, we make a point of talking to the drivers to find out where they like to go to eat, because you really can find the better food. Those are little ways you can really get to know culture and certainly the destination and appreciate them. And I think now, in all honesty, when we get beyond where we are right now with COVID-19, I think because people haven't been able to travel because, that's been taken away from them, I think we'll see a sea change in people. I think people will want to start finding a lot more meaning in their travel going forward. And so we will see people really wanting to get to know locals, because these are the same people who we share this common experience of COVID-19 with. And that does something. It's like we've all gone to war together.
Going state to state at this point, of course, every governor is handling the lockdowns a little bit differently. So we did a beach vacation a couple weeks ago and really were aware when we crossed over from Virginia into North Carolina what differences we were going to see, what the towns were going to look like. And then talking with the people that are from there to see what their experience has been up to that point. It almost feels like going from a country to a country, more so than it ever really did before in domestic travel.
Yeah, well, we were in your area, your state, this past weekend. We did a camping trip in Chincoteague because I wanted to see the wild ponies. I'm an equestrian, so I really wanted to see them. I forgot that Virginia's laws were a lot more relaxed than Maryland's. We're in Maryland. And so we continued to wear our mask, even at the campground, and certainly when we went to the beach. And one day we actually went to the beach mid-morning, and it was so crowded that we turned right around and left because nobody had masks on. And so the following day we went earlier, and my husband, bless him, drew a line in the sand and he wrote 6 feet in front of us and on the side. So he kind of drew a barrier for us in the sand. And some people applauded us and, gave us thumbs up, and a couple of other people complained. And I think one person actually crossed our border. In our states, and particularly in Maryland, where the COVID cases have been on the rise. I mean, nothing like North Carolina or Florida or whatever, but we're very, very careful. And so I made no apologies. We had to wear a mask going in the stores. And so I was very pleased about that. But like you said, it was almost like another world. It was very surreal where, we saw all these people who came from different places and not wearing masks because, one, they thought they were okay being outside. There was no social distancing on the playground for the children. That was okay in Virginia.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's going to continue to be that way for a while. I've not been on an airplane since everything has been going on. Have you happened to have any opportunity to be on an airplane?
No, and I'm truly not interested at this particular point. I mean, I think I honestly think it would be okay because there are not a lot of people flying. We actually were on a plane right as, like mid-March, right as things started shutting down here. That was very uncomfortable. We had just come off a cruise, and we're not cruisers. That's just not our preferred way of traveling. But we had friends who were getting married, and so we attended their wedding. And it was nice. The cruise was actually half capacity, which was wonderful. So there's a lot of social distancing going on there. At the time, there weren't a lot of cases in the U.S. I think there were 6 deaths out west, and so we thought we were okay. And then we were gone. Whilst we were gone, all hell broke loose, and we came back to a big mess. But that was the last time we were on a plane, and I'm supposed to be moderating a panel in October in Milwaukee, and so I'm kind of waiting to see how things go. But I'm not keen on flying at this particular juncture.
Similarly, we don't have really anything on the radar in the near future. I think we've got a couple things earmarked for the fall. And of course, just like how everything has gone, we will see what happens. We'll see how it goes up to that point. Interestingly enough, the last time I was on a plane was the exact same reason you were. We were on a cruise at the very end of February into March. And at that time, they were doing the checks to say, have you been in China within the last 3 to 6 months? I honestly forget how far back. And they would not let you on for that. But it's so strange to even think back to that time at this point to go, oh, we thought that was it. And nothing else was going to come of it. And then, of course, less than a month later is when it really started to heat up. And we find ourselves in the position that we're in now.
Some people are being prohibited from traveling across state lines because we're not prohibited, but they're being required to go into 2-week isolation, self-isolation. And, and it's justifiable. The EU now, the European Union is prohibiting U.S. travelers from crossing any of their borders. And I think it's justifiable because, if people are being so reckless here, certainly, they're going to be just as reckless overseas. These countries, the governments want to protect their own people, and Italy's already been hit hard. France has been hit hard. I mean, England continues to be hit hard. Greece is the only one that's kind of skated away, but. And in Australia, well, that's not Europe, but there are other countries that have done really well with this because they set restrictions right away and were very strict. Why invite potential carriers back into your borders?
What do you see for areas like the Caribbean that I imagine are pretty dependent on tourism in general, and B, I would also imagine the bulk of their tourists are coming from America. Do you think that they'll have a similar stance given what the global perspective on the U.S. response has been? Or do you think that they're going to have to be a little more relaxed just because of how much their economies depend on U.S. travelers?
That's a great question, and we had been following press releases coming from the Caribbean, from some of the islands. I think they are relaxing, but cautiously relaxing. And so I think just as New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut are doing, may depend on where people depart from, however they can enforce. But I'm not 100% sure. From what I've been able to read quickly, I think, they are starting to relax a little bit. And some of their numbers have not been too bad. Now, there's some islands, like the U.S. Virgin Islands, they were a little bit slow to respond. Puerto Rico, I think, same thing. And the British Virgin Islands, I think, were a little bit quicker to respond. And we, of course, Mexico is very slow to respond, and we know what's happening there too right now.
By and large, what fits into the theme, I think, of what we've talked about, both in the benefits of travel and what's going on with COVID, is general recommendation for people is be safe, make sure you're paying attention to the appropriate agencies and what they're recommending, and hey, even have a little bit of consideration for these places that you think you'd like to travel to. I know for myself, really loving travel and wanting to be an avid traveler, it's been a hard pill to swallow, but there are other people out there other than yourself, which is what we're saying is a benefit of travel that you can remind yourself of. So folks should definitely stay up on what the current trends are and what the current recommendations are. And so we focused on some of these near-term changes that have happened. What do you foresee long-term? Have you really started to consider what may be a new mainstay in travel precautions?
I mean, I think it's going to depend on when we get a vaccine, when we'll be able to freely travel again. I don't see airlines really recovering. I don't see that happening for about a year. And so I think a lot of people going forward will stick closer to home. I mean, I think people want to be a lot safer than anything. And so most people will continue trying to social distance, although I didn't really see that at the beach. Most people will be a little bit more careful. And so they'll look to things like camping because, you're naturally physically distanced from your next tent over. And, they'll look towards the open spaces. And then I think when we can start crossing state lines freely, people are going to look, maybe do longer road trips and go to some of the secondary and tertiary cities where there won't be a lot of tourists. There'll be a lot of offerings, wonderful gems, but not popular tourism spots like Vegas or anything of that sort. Overseas travel, I don't think we're going to see that recover for at least a year.
Do you think the ways that people tour a certain area might change as well? So, of course, the obvious example is cruises, and who knows what that's going to look like and how long it's going to take to get to a point where people view it as safe and healthy again. But I'm even thinking other things like amusement parks or traveling by tour bus for those kind of packaged European tours or other areas like that. Do you think maybe those will either modify or go away because people will just want to be in smaller groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think even before COVID-19, people were trending towards smaller groups anyways, because those types of trips offer a lot more intimacy. They generally have more access to smaller areas or, smaller towns. We've done a lot of cruising on, well, not a lot. We've done some cruising on very, very small ships, like large yachts. And so, with a smaller bus, with a smaller ship, you can go into areas and easily access areas that the larger buses and the larger cruise ships can't. I don't see amusement parks closing down. I mean, Disney is, you're talking about Disney earlier. Disney's trying to open right now. I think they're doing their best to implement social distancing protocols. I think we'll see everybody being scanned, their forehead scanned for temperatures as we go into any place. We're not going to see travel return to what we've been accustomed to. We will find a new normal with travel. Take a group, these large group tours, and instead maybe do a bicycle tour or something a little bit smaller and intimate, or cross-country trips. We're going to see a lot of that, and you can hire RV campers now. A lot of people are selling their homes and buying RV campers and really enjoying having that freedom, not being stuck in one place, but having the freedom to roam. And you're already physically distanced in those things and really self-contained. That's what we're going to see.
In many ways, I think it can be for the better. Funny you mentioned the smaller cruise ships. We were actually supposed to go to Alaska. Like you, I don't really consider myself a cruise person. I've been on my share of them, but for our kids being the age they are, 3 and 5, cruises make a whole lot of sense because I can go see something that's not just right around my area. And of course, it's way easier to travel with kids of that age. Well, of course, that was supposed to be on one of the big ships that has all of the extra activities for kids so that they're occupied. And since then, we've done some more research on these smaller boats. And to the point that you made about being able to get to areas that these large ships or larger groups can't get to, Alaska is an example of that. The large ships can't get as far in to see, I think, some of the glaciers and things like that, that the smaller ships can. So we've already sort of shifted our perspective a little bit to say, okay, postpone this maybe for a few more years once the kids are older and can appreciate it a little bit more. And we're not as worried about, is there a playground or other things like that that could really make it a better experience. Similarly, I didn't know anything about river cruises within the US. Like the Mississippi River has a number of things that would probably take you to towns that you wouldn't otherwise have even considered being able to go to. So I think there is certainly a silver lining to that. And also for the other modes that you mentioned, if you're in the smaller groups, you're probably going to have more chances to interact with people from the area. And that will also enhance your experience.
Now, mind you, when we travel, most of our travels are press trips. So, a lot of our itinerary, if we're going in a small group, we don't travel with a bunch of journalists. But, I think the largest group we've traveled in, it was maybe 9 people to Namibia. But even with those types of trips that we've taken, we get to interact with locals and taste local foods, even grub, which are basically, they look like caterpillars to me. But we get to do that. We get access to things that may not necessarily be open to the public. We have traveled, press trips aside. We did a small cruise in Alaska, and it was phenomenal. I think there was about 3 people on our boat. Nobody was on top of one another. It was large enough to have space. Whales would come right up to our boat, and then we could go out into skiffs, those little dinghies. And whales would come up to us, or we could go into a little inlet and see the bear population, trying to feed. And, we met naturalists who talked about just the local flora and fauna and the ecosystem. The smaller groups are going to be, because people will be trying to find meaning and make their holidays count more. I think we'll see a lot of those smaller trips happening.
Going with the theme of locals, and you mentioned that you've been on a number of different councils and groups that speak about diversity and inclusion. Let's flip that a little bit. What do you see in the just world of travel diversity looking like? Is the opportunities to be able to go out and experience the world well distributed, or is there a lot of work to be done there?
There's a lot of work to be done. If you're talking about the travel writing industry or travel journalism industry where my husband and I live, when we're sent on press trips, we don't see other people of color. We're usually the only 2 people of color. We don't see a lot of people of color in leadership roles, hotel chains or the cruise lines, or just across the board, other ethnic groups really having the space to tell the story, to tell stories. And we've seen a couple of times, in the Caribbean and perhaps most predominantly, there are other writers that we know that are very accomplished writers and maybe of Asian descent, other people of color, but they're, for whatever reason, PR firms and even the tourism boards do not value their voice as they would a non-Black person or a non-person of color. for the Caribbean, and those are, those islands are populated with people of color. So it's really interesting. Even the airlines. I mean, you go down the line. I was actually talking to an NBC anchor out of New York, and she's an African American woman. She's in an interracial relationship with a white woman. And she was saying, even in her area, when people want a soundbite, particularly during Pride, and, we just finished Pride Month, when people want a soundbite, they don't consider that there's a Black lesbian woman who could provide the same soundbite, but most news organizations will go to a white gay guy, and so there's a lot of room for growth.
I thought maybe we would be hitting, I guess, just socioeconomic means being the issue, but it doesn't sound like it. It sounds like maybe there's even some mind shifts that need to be done to make sure that people can sort of get past their preconceived notions.
The sad thing is that particularly on these press trips or even these editorial boards, the editorial boards really need to broaden their pool of writers, because what they're doing is allowing only one side of a story to be told. So I may go somewhere like, I don't know, we'll just pick, we'll say Chesapeake Bay or whatever, which is an area we both know of. I may go there with somebody else who doesn't look like me, and we may find different things, or we will find different things to focus on. And so when these editorials, when these publications limit the voices that tell the story, they're really limiting the story.
Especially, I'm still processing the story you told about like the Caribbean and who would be able to represent the area. To your point, it would make sense. Like, obviously, I think everybody understands it would be people of color that are native to the area. And continuing our theme, most avid travelers want to understand the place they're traveling to from the local people. So I'm still processing why that would be a hard concept, I guess, to embrace.
Yeah, you're good at your guess is as good as mine, I'm afraid.
Well, from the standpoint of change starts with individuals, is there certain steps that you would advise people to take, whether they're in the industry like you are day in, day out, or even as someone like myself that just really likes to travel, to help with awareness or create some kind of change?
Studying, learning a little bit about the place that you're traveling to is a start. And looking at the space we're in right now, the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter movement, and certainly, COVID-19, which continues to plague us. I think there's a lot of interest now in how can I be an ally, or, how can I be an anti-racist, or how can I confront my own unconscious bias? Really, the starting point is just to acknowledge that it's there. And like I said, we all have unconscious bias. I mean, I'm just as guilty as anyone else, because I confronted mine and I realized, just like my friend who I was telling you about, the jazz artist, she didn't realize that she had this unconscious bias against Germans. I didn't realize I had an unconscious bias towards Afrikaners until I was, ended up coming face to face with a few who ended up being very close friends of mine for years. So I think just acknowledging that is a good starting point. And golly, there's webinars, there's books. The book White Fragility, I think, is quite popular right now with people to just help them understand, and, not in a judgmental way, but I think in a very educational way. I do the same when I'm traveling to other countries. I did the same before I went to China. I spent an enormous amount of time in China, whilst in law school. The same with India. I had a speaking engagement in India, and I had to understand the culture a little bit better before I went, because I had some preconceived notions about who Indian people were, Asian Indian people were. I didn't know how we'd be perceived in Iceland. Montana, I'll go more domestic. Montana, Alabama, I was nervous as all heck before we traveled to Birmingham, Alabama for a conference. And we came away loving that place, even though, there's gross issues. There's still a lot of issues going on there. But I know that people are trying, they're trying to repair race relations. We see what's happening now with Mississippi, taking down, removing the, Confederate flag from their state flag, and taking the time to understand other cultures and the places and to see what's going on, I think will help anyone before they attempt to travel. And one of the things I tell people on a couple of my talks I've done, we have so many more things in common than we have differences, and the similarities should be really celebrated, and our differences honored, because that's what makes us richer. I guarantee anyone, yourself, anyone listening, if they were just to go and say hello, start a conversation with somebody who looks very different from them, they will find commonalities in less than 5 minutes. I mean, it's that easy. And I think those little things, will help start to shift paradigms and belief systems.
Absolutely true. Wholeheartedly agree with get to know an individual person within a culture that at best you don't know about, and at worst, you've got preconceived notions of, and you will more often than not find some commonalities. And then you can start to learn more about how things really are or what their perspective happens to be. I can't help myself. I have to tell one lighthearted version of the same concept. I went to Los Angeles for the first time in my life, I think about 18 months ago. And I am definitely the type to roll my eyes about Hollywood and the whole scene there. But you know what? When we went to go get food or we're going from destination to destination, people were actually very friendly, more so than I thought they were going to be. And I was like, wow, I thought everybody would be really stuffy and not want to talk to you and be in crazy designer clothes and all the things that, were my assumptions before we actually went out there. So even from that standpoint, you can be proven wrong for sure.
Yeah, well, in all honesty, and I lived in Southern California. I'm also a Southern Cal girl. There's a lot of transplants there. So, you're going to probably, I'd say, a lot of Midwesterners, and I'm quite partial to my Midwesterners. There's a history. There's some beautiful history in LA and some historical eateries. There's so much more than that bloody Hollywood sign. I hate the traffic. I absolutely hate the traffic. But there's just so much more to these, these destinations. And I think if you, again, go with an open mind, don't set expectations, but set intentions. What do you want to get out of your trip? What do you want to experience? Anything you want to see? Any new food you want to try? Doing those things, I think, will just really enrich your holiday travel. And people should travel, Greg, and that's the thing. And so, can I just say one quick thing to our audience?
Absolutely.
I hope Americans, particularly because we've been in lockdown for so long and will not be able to travel again far anytime soon, I hope at least people will take their 2 weeks holiday that they have a year. I cannot believe how much holiday, vacation days and dollars are leaving on the table. And I saw a research study done by the U.S. Travel Association, Oxford Economics, and Ipsos. And they said last year, in 2019, there were 768 million days of vacation left on the table. And of those, 236 million were forfeited, which really equated to about $65.5 billion in lost benefits. And I'm here to say if anyone wants to waste their holiday days and the money associated, I will happily accept. I mean, that's just a lot of days and money left on the table, and I don't understand why.
It is a great point. As a matter of fact, one of the shows that we did, her name is Nicole O'Sullivan. She's an Australian travel agent coach, and she reminded me that Australians get mandatory minimum 5 weeks as compared to Americans who are lucky to get there 2 and actually take their 2. And I was actually on a show with a gentleman from the UK, and it was a similar theme. We were hashing out a little bit why it is that Americans in particular have such a hard time ripping themselves away from their day-to-day work and actually enjoy their holiday, whatever that means to the person. So that is absolutely good advice. And Tonya, before I get you out of here, let's do a couple quick hits. So as you've mentioned, you've been to a lot of different places. What is your favorite place to travel to?
You're asking a travel journalist, really?
You don't have to pick one. You can maybe give me a few.
Oh my gosh. Well, I love Namibia. I really enjoyed India. South Africa. I mean, the Southern African countries are phenomenal. Iceland. We love Iceland. And surprisingly, Brazil. There's just something about Brazil, the Portuguese culture. We love Portugal as well. I mean, really take a dart and just let me throw it on a map because you'll get an easier answer that way. Brazil, I think, is probably a country that really spoke to my husband and I a lot. And again, we went there with, we were concerned because we covered the Olympic Games. We have been covering the Olympic and Paralympic Games, and so we went for the Games, and there was a lot in the media about crime and the Zika virus, and we decided to go just to learn that the Zika mosquito was concentrated in another part of the country, and crime wasn't as bad as they made it out to be. So we did what I call ground truthing. So we found our own truth on the ground. And that's just a piece of advice I want to leave with your audience too, is to not be afraid to ground truth and form their own opinion outside of media.
That is advice that people can take beyond travel, even as just a daily reminder to experience things themselves, form their own opinion, as you said, and it'll probably make them all the better for it. Well, Tonya, before I let you go, do you want to go ahead and give folks your contact information for yourself or for World Footprints and let folks know if there's any events or anything else that they should be aware of for you?
We have an incredible podcast coming up on World Footprints, which they'll be able to find at worldfootprints.com, and footprints is plural. This is going to be a 3-part series about a colleague of ours who actually got trapped in India at the height of the COVID-19 and narrowly escaped. I mean, and I will say it was a very harrowing and emotional exercise for her. So that's coming up. We certainly have a lot of great articles on our site. One article just recently published about a photographer, a humanitarian photographer, and her view of war-torn Sudan refugees. Worldfootprints.com. I'm also on Facebook at Tonya Fitzpatrick and LinkedIn, but we're at World Footprints on all social media platforms except TikTok. I'm not at TikTok yet.
So I have to laugh because I just went on TikTok and I put a retirement video was the first thing I put on there, just proving I have no business on TikTok.
I honestly, Greg, I don't want to have to put on makeup and, do my hair every single day. I mean, I'm enjoying working from home.
Exactly.
Nobody sees me.
Well, and of course, we'll put all of your contact information into the show notes. Again, I really appreciate you joining the show. Had a great time, great conversation, and we'll be in touch.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get podcasts. If you'd like to be notified of future weekly episodes, please hit the subscribe button. If you'd like to help us even further, visit suburbanfolk.com and you'll find a donate button where all the money goes back into the show for you. Thanks for listening. Suburban Folk is part of the Pod All the Time podcasting network with 12 other great podcasts. Head over to suburbanfolk.com for links to their shows. We're also part of the Ring Media Network. Go to ringmedia.com to learn more. That's RRING media.com.